With some trepidation, which I'll explain in a few moments, I want to move forward and talk about culture and the influences of culture both globally and nationally upon intimate partner violence. Violence against women stretches across the globe and has existed throughout history. Entire cultures permit or encourage violence against women. But the recognition of the problem is far from universal. There are a number of factors around the globe which influence and correlate with male intimate partner violence, such as a lack of economic support, immigrant status, alcohol use, attitudes that promote violence, or at least permit it, lack of legal protections, gender inequality, which is rampant in many cultures, and the chaos that is generated by wars and civil unrest that will inflate the level of violence in different spots around the globe. Women are as likely, or even sometimes more likely than men, to believe that wife beating is justified. Fundamentalist religious dogma all across the globe appears to be at the core of a large share of violence against women. The concept of cultural relativism suggests that a society cannot intrude on another society simply because it has different attitudes and practices about marriage, child-rearing, and education. What an American feminist would call abuse, an Asian male might call teaching a woman how to be a good wife. Now, this concept of cultural relativism is controversial, to say the least, in sociological circles and social circles as well, but this is a concept that is worthy of keeping in mind as we discuss this topic. And the question, of course, that emerges is, how do we integrate human rights campaign around the globe with the concept of cultural relativism in relation to women's rights around the world? Some of the practices involving women around the world go beyond the pale in the minds of most of us in American society, but in some of those particular cultures, there is purpose to those practices that, whether we agree with it or not, is something that is very real to those individuals. Now, I want to say, and this is where my trepidation comes in, and this is a sort of disclaimer, that the information that I give you in this lecture about the trends, the customs, characteristics of people and the various cultures around the world, and also those groups within the United States, is provided with an understanding that these are generalizations provided to us by research and surveys and observations by sociologists about these particular groups. The information should not be taken as truth about all persons within the group, nor should an assumption be made that any one individual within that group could be expected to subscribe to the beliefs or engage in the practices that are indicated here. People are individuals, and no matter what the traditional practices and beliefs may be in their culture, they may not necessarily agree with those practices and beliefs. Likewise, over time, cultures evolve and grow beyond the traditional beliefs. And so some of the information that you're going to hear me talk about in terms of some of the characteristics of a few of the cultures around the globe may actually be being modified as we speak, because of advances in understanding and knowledge. But these traditional beliefs, these traditional practices, have a great bearing upon the role of women and thus the presence of intimate partner violence in many places around the world. While we do our professional homework as we work with clients, we approach our clients with a culturally informed practice. We should always remember that the client is an individual who may or may not have been raised with the generalized beliefs and patterns that characterize their ethnic or racial group, and they may or may not conform their own beliefs and practices to that of the culture of origin. So that said, I'll go forward with these observations, wincing here and there with some of the things that are included, but nonetheless, these are the things that studies and research and observations have given us. Here's a good illustration of why I have some concerns about this. Consider the information that's provided by the Asian Pacific Institute on gender-based violence. Now, this was a website 10 years old now, although I think this information has been updated to a certain extent. But look at the situation involving Muslim Americans. First of all, Muslims are not an ethnic group, it's a religious group. And so to characterize Muslim Americans as one group is really kind of a fallacy, and here's a good example of why. About 65% of the Muslims in the United States were foreign-born, so about a third of them were actually born in the United States, are American citizens by virtue of their birth. 27% of those U.S. Muslims emigrated from South and Central Asia, places like Pakistan and India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, A little over a third of the Muslims in the United States self-identify as African American, which is the largest racial group within this particular community. So there's an entirely different set of cultures for those individuals who have immigrated from African nations as well. About a third, a little more than a third, see themselves as African American, and nearly 1 in 5 Muslim Americans self-identify as Asian. So you have Asian cultures, you have African cultures, you have religious factors involvement in American society as well. So when we encounter a Muslim American in our work, will the individual self-identify as American or as an Asian American, an Asian, and a Muslim, or maybe not a Muslim because they have left their religion? Where are their primary identification? And perhaps they see themselves as belonging to 2 or 3 of those groups. How does the individual view the self, as an individual from one culture or many different cultures? And how does society, this is another factor, how does society view that individual based possibly on his or her appearance, upon the profession the individual practices, religious beliefs, clothing, lifestyle, economic status, all of those kinds of things. So you see here, when we talk about cultural influences on day-to-day living and on the beliefs as they impact intimate partner violence, you can see that it's a very complicated picture. So again, take these observations that I'm about to share with you for what they're worth. And in some cases, maybe that isn't so much. So first, let's take a look at different cultures around the globe and the prevalence of intimate partner violence. What are some of the characteristics of cultures, again, traditional practices and beliefs perhaps, that may either contribute to IPV or perhaps work against it? In Africa, for instance, there's a broad range of female behaviors that are used as a justification for violence against women. It is a very paternalistic society where men oftentimes own women or believe they have ownership in women. Intergenerational violence is created as a result of witnessing violence, not only in the home, but violence in their nation around them. There are practices such as forced early marriages and polygamous relationships as well. And in some cultures in Africa, such practices as female genital mutilation are used in order to control the sexual activities of young girls. There is a theory that may imply some in understanding Africa to a certain extent. When one partner has more resources, and that might include income or more power, like in male dominance, than the other person in the relationship, then partner violence is going to increase. And this is certainly characteristic of many relationships in Africa. Nigeria is an example you may have heard about in the news, where an Islamic extremist group by the name of Boko Haram have from time to time kidnapped large groups, hundreds of school-aged girls and boys at different times as well, and used them as negotiating pawns to try to get some of their leaders released from incarceration. Some of those girls have been sold into slavery by this group, and 100 or more of them in different kidnappings over the years haven't been seen or heard from again. So we don't really know what has become of them. Some girls have escaped and talked with officials about what went on. But one of the leaders of Boko Haram was quoted as saying that the girls shouldn't be in school. Instead, they should be married, since girls as young as 9 are suitable for marriage in their culture. But on the other hand, Ghana is more egalitarian culture and society in terms of decision-making among the genders. There is equality in economic contributions, and because of that, there's a reduced battering atmosphere there. In Asia, there are many, many, many different cultures with vast disparities in them from one to the other. So again, when we say Asia, we're talking about dozens and dozens of different cultures. In many Asian countries, not all, but in many of them, women lack the most basic rights concerning their own bodies. In Korea, for instance, there are beliefs that lead to women staying with abusive husbands for a lot of different reasons, such as that family members should stick together, the wife should care for the family and sacrifice her own desires on behalf of the family, and that the woman's first priority is obedience to husbands, never to talk back. In India, in some parts of the country, a young woman must obey all men, and men may beat younger wives at will. Many of the marriages in the traditional cultures in India are arranged marriages. In a traditional Indian household, women are expected to serve their husbands, and the mother-in-law has a great deal of power over the younger women in the family. A young wife brought into an Indian male's family has the lowest status of all individuals within that household. In many traditional Indian homes, all a man has to say is "get some water," and doesn't even necessarily direct that to anybody in particular, and one of the veiled women in the household will get it. And beyond that, the woman isn't really supposed to give this directly to the man, but to set down the water in a place where he can fetch it himself. It would violate Hindu customs about pollution otherwise. In Nepal, menstruating women are considered unclean. Women only get leftovers after the men eat their meal. In Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, in those areas, there's also some practices of acid throwing on the faces of women in order to disfigure them and to punish them for their behaviors. In Vietnam, both genders support gender inequality in a lot of different ways. Again, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Tajikistan, they share the Muslim faith and have similar attitudes toward women. For instance, that women's movement away from the home is very restricted unless a male relative is with that woman, and when they're out of the home, their face must be covered. They have to wear a burqa, which essentially covers their entire body. They don't go to school, they can't hold a job, and they can be denied food if they don't meet the man's sexual desires. You may be aware of the story of Malala Yousafzai. Malala is what she's known as. And in 2012, this 15-year-old had taken an exam, and she and a couple other girls were shot by Taliban gunmen in an assassination attempt. They were retaliating because she was an activist as a 15-year-old on behalf of education for girls in that culture. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, females are not, by traditional Muslim beliefs, women aren't to be educated. The gunman fled the scene. She was hit in the head with a bullet and remained unconscious and in critical condition for quite some time. I think her face was actually disfigured as well. But eventually she recovered and in 2014 was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But after her recovery, and I see this is cut off on the bottom, but after her recovery, Taliban leaders in Pakistan responded to the condemnation around the world for their assault on her by denouncing Malala and indicated plans for a possible second assassination attempt, which was justified as a religious obligation in their minds. Moving to the Middle East, human rights abuses against women are fairly rampant in those societies. These are honor-based societies where man's honor depends upon women's public behavior, and men can punish and even kill women for engaging in behaviors that are considered to be unacceptable for the honor of the family and of the males in the home. In Egypt, beating your wife is the result of cultural tradition justified by both sexes. In Israel, our sources say that there are pro-violent attitudes that are prevalent across much of the nation. But in the kibbutz, which is the communal living communities that exist around Israel, there is gender equality as one of the principles that they practice, and violence against women is almost unheard of. So again, you see the more equal the genders are in terms of their power and influence, the less likely that IPV is going to occur in those relationships. In Palestine, there's strong approval of wife beating by both men and women. There's over 60% in both categories, in both genders, approve wife beating. Ethiopia, a woman's worth is measured in terms of her role both as a mother and a wife. The United Nations analysis of several international studies suggested that domestic violence against women is most prevalent in Ethiopia. And in fact, the 2004 Criminal Code of Ethiopia rape as compelled sexual intercourse outside of wedlock. Drill down into that a little bit more, you begin to see that it's virtually impossible to prosecute any kind of case of such a thing as marital rape, but it certainly does imply that a wife is not entitled to deny sex to her husband. And there is, in general, a conspiracy or collusion among health professionals in the Middle East, according to our sources at least, a conspiracy of silence about violence against women. Efforts and responses in Europe to IPV have lagged behind the United States. The Istanbul Convention was the most comprehensive international human rights treaty on violence against women and domestic violence. And all the EU member states signed the convention, but its ratification continues to be challenged in areas such as Bulgaria, Czechia, Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, Slovakia, and also the United Kingdom. Muslim women, women with disabilities, and other women in Europe face more severe forms of discrimination and are exposed to higher risk of violence because of that. And within the LGBTQI population, gender exacerbates the risk of falling victim to violence, with the most vulnerable individuals in Europe in this group being those whose gender expression doesn't match their assigned sex at birth and intersex people. The general belief in many cultures around Europe is that women should simply just leave their abusive partners. There's not a lot of research in Russia regarding male-to-female partner violence, but there's certainly a belief that risk factors such as alcoholism and the male partner's exposure to his father's physical abuse of his mother probably increase the concerns about IPV in that nation. In that nation as well, any communal living facilities are also something of a protective factor. Many different cultures in Latin America, a few characteristics, patriarchal practices. Much of Latin America is tied to the Roman Catholic faith, although this is becoming less so as fundamentalist Protestantism has actually begun to get a foothold in nations, I believe, such as Brazil. Many of those practices, those beliefs arise from traditional beliefs about husbands and wives and marriages. Machismo and Marianissimo is the, and I'm not pronouncing that properly, I'm sure, is the sort of a correlate to machismo, which first of all invests a certain amount of power in women because of their ability to give birth, but at the same time expects passivity and submissiveness from them in relation to the male of the household. So there's a very authoritarian family structure. Again, these are traditional beliefs, not necessarily characteristics of all families living in or coming from Latin America. In some of those societies, women are pressured to marry the rapist, and the rapist then becomes exonerated because he's married to his victim. Social ties tend not to be as supportive in Mexico, and if the wife lives with in-laws, sometimes can be treated very unfavorably. The simple statement that the United States, Canada, and Greenland have recognized male-to-female intimate partner violence as a social problem. That's really all that is said about that, and we'll leave it at that because that's what we're studying this semester. Now we're going to take a look at factors that contribute to IPV among cultural groups in the United States. A reminder of my proviso about not allowing ourselves to overgeneralize about individuals within these groups. But here are some characteristics and some features of the experiences of individuals that belong to different cultural groups in the United States. First, we start with Native American, Alaska Native. The tribes have values that recognize the interdependent nature of the relationship of members. And the principles from one tribe to the other vary, as other speakers have told us, but there is one principle that's held, at least one principle, and this is the nature of interdependence, the idea that we rely upon each other. While many tribes look for input from women before decisions are made, final authority tends to still rest with the males in traditional Native American tribes. It's worth noting that the vast majority of domestic violence, family violence, and sexual assault that involve Native American women, and we've heard a lot about the statistics involving this, and we'll hear more. The vast majority of these assaults have been committed by non-natives, oftentimes non-natives living in the villages, and the issue has been that the tribal authorities haven't had the power to do anything about it to protect the women in their tribes until 2013, with the revision of the Violence Against Women Act gave the tribes power to prosecute crimes involving non-natives in their tribal area. Until that time, at least, most of these crimes went unpunished, and that, I'm sure, has something to do with the problem with sexual assault and IPV involving Native females in the villages. Interesting question with VAWA actually having been sunsetted in 2018 or so, and is awaiting renewal in Congress at this time, whether or not that authority continues. I presume that it does, but I am not certain of that. Many Native American and Alaska Native communities have very few law enforcement officers residing in them. You're probably aware of the Village Public Safety Officers, the VPSOs, which are individuals that are hired, but they, as I understand it, cannot carry weapons. And so their ability to enforce a law with violent individuals sometimes is very restricted. When officers are present or nearby or able to get there relatively quickly, they're covering vast territories, and oftentimes it's days before they can reach the scenes of the crimes because of distance and because of weather and other conditions. In communities without law enforcement, there's such a problem as how to manage a perpetrator until law enforcement reaches the community. It's interesting that Peterson text talks about, and this isn't new information to any of us, but it's one of the first times I've ever seen this gathered, which is a list of some of the obstacles that are, let's say, peculiar to individuals that live in Alaska Native villages, rural villages, off the road system, and the kinds of things that lead to victims of IPV having a much more formidable challenge in terms of deciding to leave a relationship and to be protected in a violent relationship situation. Some of the factors here that they mention that affect natives in their stay or leave dilemma include the isolation of the communities, the distance between them, and the lack of easy transportation back and forth, severe weather, lack of adequate law enforcement, prevalence of alcohol and other drugs. Although many native communities are dry, some permit alcohol to be brought into the village, even if not sold there. Others prohibit it altogether, but that doesn't mean that alcohol and drugs aren't in the villages. There's a prevalence of weapons. There's a culture that relies upon hunting, and so there's a fair amount of weapons as well. So you have this combination of alcohol and weaponry in communities, again, without law enforcement. Absence of basic public services in many of these, particularly the smaller, more remote communities, such as alternative housing, transportation, health facilities, lack of employment opportunities, and this leading to dependence upon public assistance that results. Infrequent contacts with mental health professionals and treatment specialists also make it very difficult to deal with the problems that are associated with IPV. If an individual is to leave the village or leave the community, go live somewhere else or go to a shelter, whatever it might be, there's the expense of leaving the community. The cost of travel can be exorbitant sometimes. Getting to a community where there are treatment and shelter facilities. There is a lack of secure and safe alternative housing. Most of the smaller communities don't have shelters. And then among those individuals who work with victims and batterers in their programs, oftentimes there's a lack of cultural sensitivity and an understanding of cultural context. And so sometimes the interventions are less meaningful. Those are all very important concepts for us practicing in Alaska and things to keep in mind. And the list, I'm sure, is quite incomplete. African Americans as a group must concern themselves with issues arising from intersectionality and institutional racism. The women in the African American community may be reluctant to speak about violence because of how African American men are treated in the justice system in the United States. And they're aware of the complications that come from that, from reporting it, and oftentimes just learn to stay silent about things. When they do speak up, oftentimes the system just isn't effective in responding to their concerns. Now, Murray Strauss and his associates in the 80s did a couple of studies and concluded that black males had higher rates of overall and severe violence toward wives in black families as compared to white families. Why is that? If you drop down here, look at things such as the social oppression, sexism, male socialization, and social learning are the underlying conditions of violence. Controlling and abusive behaviors are the result. So again, here we're looking at the economic and social impact of racism and all the different issues that arise from that as having a lot to do with this particular problem. Dual exposure to racism and sexism traps the black woman in abusive relationships. And if there are other marginalized groups that woman belongs to, that only increases the difficult circumstances that she finds herself in. Historical impact of institutionalized racism, the pressures of the church, lack of response from the justice system, poor handling by the justice system itself, and endemic poverty all serve to influence African American men and women in their response to IPV. Latinas and Hispanics represent an array of cultures or origins from many places around the world, and so again, we have to be careful about lumping them into one category in our minds. But again, we'll move forward with lumping them into one category only from a traditional cultural standpoint, which may or may not apply to all of them. Sometimes Latinas may choose to stay in abusive relationships because, as I mentioned earlier, you have the sense that the family should always come first. There's a fear of shaming the family. There's pressure from religion. I think most clerics have begun to become aware of domestic violence and the issues there, and I don't believe, as a matter of routine, have a knee-jerk reaction of encouraging women to preserve the marriage. They recognize this, but nonetheless, there are religious pressures, and sometimes not necessarily coming from the institution of the church itself, but from the older generations in the family who are very attached to the church and its teachings. And I should say churches, not just the church. Many different churches. The Christian faith focuses upon the family, as you read in the chapter on religion. Immigration is a major issue for many Latina and Hispanic individuals because of fears of possible deportation. Even legal immigrants with a green card can be deported under the wrong circumstances, and the victim knows that if she is reported to immigration services for whatever reason, that she may wind up being deported and the kids will stay behind with the abuser. Another reason to just stay silent about things. Social issues that impact this population include poverty, lack of education, lack of job skills. These things all contribute to complications for victims in IPV situations. The text points out that sometimes interpreters, you have to be careful about the interpreters, because if the interpreters hold strongly to traditional values, they may not accurately interpret what's being said because they may not be supportive of the woman's attempt to leave the relationship. So be careful about the interpreter that is selected. As the text points out, children, because they're acculturated generally better than the older generation, oftentimes they're much better with English, but you have to consider their age and their position in the family, and it's probably not wise to use them as an interpreter in these situations because they're exposed to information they probably really shouldn't be exposed to. Even if they're aware of what's going on, these are matters that really are to be dealt with between the parents and shouldn't involve the kids. Again, Asian and Pacific Islanders, it's just such a vast array of cultures, so very different from each other in many respects. I think, as the text points out, over 100 different languages are spoken within this group, and so it's a fallacy to classify these into one group. But for this discussion, we'll try to draw out a little bit from this that might have some commonalities, but these are cultures from all over the Pacific, all over the Far East, and greatly different customs and languages and cultures, economic situations. It's also important to realize that when the immigrant family arrived on the shores of America will have a great deal to do with their experience with coming to this new culture. At times where particular groups are welcomed or accepted or even encouraged to immigrate versus times when there's really nothing put in place to help them integrate, you can imagine the experience being very, very different from one period to another. And so when we're working with immigrants, it's good to know what their immigrant history is, when they arrived, and what the conditions were for them and their group as they arrived in America. Having said all of that, the responses to intimate partner violence is very complicated by different factors that are relatively common among Asian and Pacific Islander communities. And one of those is that most of these cultures are collectivist in nature as opposed to individualist. If you refer back to the Dimensions of Culture handout that was provided to you, you will see some of the basic differences among collectivist and individualist cultures, and certainly you can see from this that the interests of the community in a collectivist culture and the interests of the family generally take precedence over individual concerns. Respect for authority is a key concept, and so again, when you're looking at male-dominated households, that complicates concerns about IPV and perhaps sets it up. Families within these cultures often are discouraged from discussing the concerns about the families and relationships within it outside of the family system, and so they may be very reluctant to go to you or to other individuals in the service community or in the law enforcement community to talk about what's going on in their home. Their traditional belief systems in these cultures support male privilege. For those coming from war-torn countries and not having employment possibilities, the complications are even greater because of resettlement issues that exist for them. And so there are many reasons why IPV may not be reported by individuals coming from such communities and cultures. Finally, among Middle Easterners, Islamic faith is dominant throughout much of that part of the world, and it honors women. The Quran emphasized equality of the sexes, equal rights, the rights of women to engage in commerce and own property, the right to seek divorce, and so on. But women in the Middle East have been relegated to second-class status for many years. The very diverse nature of this population can lead to challenges for researchers and advocates, much as I referred to earlier in this discussion. While the majority of the individuals might be Muslim, not all Middle Easterners are, and responses to the incidents of domestic violence are as varied as the community is diverse. Sometimes invalidating reports of domestic violence, other times being supportive of the individuals who report it. But as Muslims, the institution of marriage is valued and is hoped to be preserved at all costs. So oftentimes the abuser is believed, and the abuser may justify his behavior by referring to isolated bits of text from the Quran. Individuals may tend to blame themselves for not being patient enough or understanding enough to help him change his behavior. Might wonder if God is punishing them or is angry with them for some past sins that they're being abused in their relationship, and might especially struggle with trying to understand how God could view their desire to end the marriage favorably. According to the Faith Trust Institute, in the last 10 years, the Muslim community has made a lot of progress in acknowledging the existence of domestic violence among Muslims and is working to create initiatives to fight the problem. Cultures evolve, and so do the individuals within it. This little meme is something that I ran across in social media some weeks ago, and I've been meaning to share it with you previously. I'm not touching on a section in the text about the working class whites here, but this kind of illustrates a little bit about that. I think a lot of people in America believe that we lose a lot when we aren't allowed to spank our kids. This speaks to that concern, I think. The men that are raised by being raised violently sometimes turn out to be violent themselves. So remember, none of these groups are monolithic. There are variations within the culture. They can be every bit as dramatic as variations from one culture to the next. And keep in mind, no matter what ethno-economic, racial group your client belongs to, your client is first and foremost an individual. I guess I've said that enough now. I hope you understand why. And in considering the impact of intimate partner violence among clients, always keep cultural factors in mind, but also look to issues involving intersectionality of the women who are the victims and survivors of IPV, because there is where a lot of the complications in cooperating in reporting, first of all, and then seeking safety and maintaining safety for herself, where those complications come from. So that's it, and I hope that you find this of some value to you, and if it generates any thoughts and concerns, please bring them to my attention, and we'll spend some time in class talking about them. Thanks for listening.